So today I'm in downtown Battle Creek. I'm right near the Mill Race Monument here where there normally is a fountain running. It's winter time, the fountain has been turned off for the season. But this commemorates the location approximately where the Mill Race stood in its day as it crossed over Michigan Avenue, which is like Main Street here. And back in 1854, a very peculiar event happened. Actually, you would call it a very bizarre incident. And it involves a very large elephant. So this is a very interesting, forgotten piece of Battle Creek history. So come along and join me. I think you're going to like this one.
To begin this story, it's perhaps best to first examine some facts about elephants. There are two main species of elephants, the African elephants and the Asiatic elephants. The African elephants, which the males can weigh between 5,000 to 14,000 pounds, or 2268 to 6350 kilograms, and have a height range between 8.2 feet to 13 feet, which is 2.5 to 4 meters, from shoulder to toe, according to National Geographic. The smaller cousins, the Asiatic elephants, also sometimes referred to as the Indian elephants, can weigh between 4,400 to 11,000 pounds, or 2,000 to 5,000 kilograms, and have a height between shoulder to toe of 6.6 to 11.5 feet, or 2 to 3.5 meters. Once again, this is based on the National Geographic collected information. National Geographic magazine was founded in 1888. However, according to their website, their cataloging of elephants only goes back 50 years. There are also two species of African elephants, the African bush elephant and the African forest elephant, the bush elephant being the larger of the two. The largest African elephant ever recorded was found in Angola and rocked a massive 24,000 pounds, that's 11,000 kilograms, and stood a shoulder height of 13 feet, that's 3.96 meters. So I'm giving you these details so that you have a context of not only how big elephants really are, but also for later when we try to sort out the fact from fiction on some of the promotions of circuses in the 1800s, as you'll find that often facts about elephants that they had in captivity were exaggerated in their marketing to sell tickets. In 1885, Jumbo the elephant, who traveled with the P.T. Barnum Circus, was billed as the largest in the world at the time. He was an African elephant who weighed 6 tons, or more exactly 12,000 pounds, 6,000 kilograms, and stood 10.6 feet tall, or about 3.2 meters. During his day, he was promoted as weighing 14,000 pounds. Jumbo was born in Sudan, East Africa, and was imported to Europe in 1865. He spent most of his life in captivity and originally was used to give children's rides at the London Zoo before he was eventually sold to P.T. Barnum in 1882. The London Zoo sold him because he had become dangerous as he was getting older, and they sold him over the protest of people living in England at the time who were outraged that they did such a thing. He arrived in New York around 1882 and would spend 3 years traveling with the P.T. Barnum Circus around North America. Jumbo was hit by a freight train and died on the tracks in St. Thomas, Ontario, Canada in 1885. Some news reports of the day said the elephant had tuberculosis and that Barnum had put him down and arranged the dramatic train scene. Other accounts said Jumbo sacrificed himself to save another elephant, which is the story that P.T. Barnum had promoted. In reality, it was an unscheduled freight train that appeared when the elephants were being loaded onto a train, and Jumbo and another smaller elephant were still on the tracks. The trainers tried to get them into a ditch, but they refused to move, and the freight train struck them both. The smaller elephant, Tom Thumb, had a broken leg, and Jumbo was struck in the rear and later died. Barnum had his skeleton in skin preserved and stuffed him, and continued to tour with him that way for 2 more years, which is really a sad fate. The taxidermy of Jumbo today can be found at Tufts University in P.T. Barnum Hall in Massachusetts, and his bones are on display in the Museum of Natural History in New York City. Old Hannibal the elephant, or sometimes referred to as just Hannibal, lived many years before Jumbo and was considered to be the largest elephant ever exhibited on the North American continent. He was named after Hannibal, the great military commander from around 218 BC, who used elephants in his army in crossing the Alps. Hannibal's height was only 8 feet 11 inches tall compared to Jumbo, who came later at 10 feet 6 inches, but Hannibal was said to weigh 15,000 pounds, about 6,804 kilograms, as opposed to Jumbo, who weighed about 3,000 pounds less. So he was shorter than Jumbo, but considerably heavier. However, there are many varying accounts on Hannibal's size. Here is a story carried in the New York Evening Post that described him as 11,000 pounds and standing 11 feet in height. However, the consensus of the other records indicate he was around 8 feet 11 inches and at least 15,000 pounds. Watch until the end of this video and I will go into more details on this. Additionally, one would assume that Hannibal was an African elephant from his weight and size descriptions. However, this detailed article in the Pittsburgh Press from 1910 makes it very clear that Hannibal was an Asiatic elephant. The article reads, "Moreover, Hannibal was the most perfect specimen of an elephant ever exhibited. Jumbo was long-legged and swayback, being an African elephant, and he had stumps where his tusks had been. Hannibal was an Asiatic elephant, fine proportioned, and had tusks 7 feet long, white as snow, and with the exquisite velvety polish of finished ivory." It should be noted that Hannibal kept his tusks for most of his life while on public display, a practice that was unheard of in later circuses because of the danger they posed. When you look at renderings of Hannibal, his ears are drawn small as opposed to the large ears of the African elephant. So this further confirms he was an Asiatic elephant, and if all accounts are accurate, he was larger than any Asiatic elephant alive in present day. So to give you some context of how heavy Hannibal was, a 2022 Ram 1500 truck has an average weight of around 7,500 pounds, or 3,401 kilograms in gross weight. So Hannibal's weight was 2 Ram 1500 trucks, or if you want another comparison, a 1967 VW Beetle weighed approximately 1,700 pounds, or 771 kilograms. So Hannibal was about the weight of approximately 9 of those. By comparison, the largest recorded elephant mentioned earlier would have been equivalent to 3.5 Ram trucks and 14 1967 VW Beetles. So any way you look at it, Hannibal was a big boy, much bigger than a human, except for maybe that one guy on my wrestling team in high school. Hannibal came to America in 1824, according to Hyatt Foster, his manager and eventually the proprietor of the Amburgh Managerie Show. A sea captain had gotten possession of him at some Asiatic port and brought him to New York, where a speculative butcher in Washington Market had purchased him. The Amburgh show people had heard of him and purchased him, denying the butcher a 6-month supply of elephant steaks, and named him Hannibal. The term menagerie was used often in those days, and it refers to a traveling exhibit of animals. The term was first introduced in 1676. The term circus was introduced in 1793 in Philadelphia and included not only traveling animal exhibits, but acrobatics and other events as part of the show. Menageries later adopted performance acts as well, but many continued to use the term menagerie through the 1800s. Perhaps it was because it was a more commonly known term from a marketing perspective in the day. There were 2 different owners of the Amburgh show during Hannibal's lifetime. Isaac Amburgh was the original curator of the Amburgh Managerie, and he was quite a showman. Here are some illustrations of him posing with a mix of tigers and lions in the same cage. He owned Hannibal throughout most of the years of his life. However, Hyatt Foster was his manager for many years and took over the menagerie when Amburgh died in 1865 and continued using the name. Following Hannibal's arrival on the scene, the show produced the then famous Four Tandem elephant team with a gorgeous golden band chariot, which for 5 years was the feature of the show's outdoor exhibition and was seen in every town, village, and city from the Hudson to the Mississippi. Hannibal's companion elephants were Columbus, Virginius, and Pizarro. During that time, when the famous Four Tandem was part of the show, Hannibal was always the largest of the group. In 1825, Hannibal distinguished himself in New York by saving the life of his keeper by the name of Joseph Martin. A larger tiger and tigress had escaped from their cage and attacked a llama that had been allowed to roam in the building in which they were staying. Mr. Martin, hearing the noise and commotion, entered the building without suspecting the extent of the danger. When the tiger immediately crouched to spring at him, Martin was entirely unarmed. Suddenly, Hannibal rushed forward and seized the keeper with his trunk and raised him up out of danger and held him safely until assistance arrived and the tigers were secured. At the opening of the show season in 1847, the show was starting out from Philadelphia for a tour in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The two elephants, Pizarro and Virginius, either from dislike of their new keeper or because they had a sudden case of stubbornness, refused to board a ferry boat on which they were to cross the Delaware River. All efforts to induce them to get aboard the ferry were fruitless, so it was decided to swim them across. Unfortunately, to do this, it was thought necessary to chain them together. In pairs, they entered the water willingly and cheerfully. Pizarro was paired with Virginius, and Hannibal was paired with Columbus. At first, they were swimming along all right when Pizarro became chilled and struggled for movement and went down, dragging Virginius with him. Both animals drowned. Apparently, Columbus had the notion to give up as well and drown, chained to Hannibal, but Hannibal wanted nothing to do with that. He managed to unchain himself and swim to shore alone, and Columbus wisely followed. I came across two different accounts of this incident, one that said Pizarro pulled Virginius down, the other one said Virginius pulled Pizarro down. But the one thing they were both clear on is that both elephants drowned. That left just two elephants in the Van Amburgh show after this incident, and it marked the end of the original Four Tandem showcase event. In a book written by J. Jacob Oswendal entitled Notes of the Mexican War 1846-47-48, he describes an encounter with the menagerie regarding Hannibal and Columbus in the city of New Orleans around a New Year's Day parade. He said, when everything was accomplished to make a grand display, a little before the time of forming the procession, Hannibal got stubborn and wanted to fight Columbus. The keeper, Mr. William Crum, had him finally quieted down for a while, but soon afterwards Columbus got his back up and showed a disposition of wanting to fight or do mischief. From there he described how before Crum could do anything, Columbus struck his horse to the ground, knocking Crum with it, and Crum fell so hard it seemed to break every bone in his body, and he soon died. Columbus then went after two mules in a wagon, but the driver made a good escape. Then the elephant went after spectators sitting on a fence and hit a man with such a shock it killed him. Columbus then had 4 or 5 bullets shot into him, and one went right through his eye, which finally made him settle down, and other men were able to capture him and tie him to a tree. The owner of the menagerie at that time had to pay several $1,000s for the damages and the carnage. In 1849, Columbus got angry while in Philadelphia and killed his keeper and took possession of the show venue and retained it for 3 days. In the process, he killed 2 camels and a llama and destroyed a large stove and 2 animal cages. The doors to the venue were barricaded, cannons were brought in and mounted on the street, soldiers paraded around the premises in readiness to shoot him should he make an appearance. In the end, 2 keepers from the show entered the building from above and straddled the crossbeams, ultimately dropping a rope noose to the floor. Columbus walked into the trap, and when he realized he was caught, he submitted quietly to being chained up again. The following summer, Columbus was crossing a bridge in North Adams, Massachusetts, and broke through the bridge, falling into the river below, and died a few days later. The skeletons of Pizarro and Virginius were, as of 1910, said to be in the Museum of the Philadelphia Academy of Science, and the skeleton of Columbus at that time was last known to be in the Boston Museum. Hannibal had his own incidents where he showed his temper and was regarded by many who worked with him as the most vicious elephant to ever travel with a show. Dr. L.A. Graves, a veteran showman who traveled with the show, described Hannibal as, of all the mad elephants, Hannibal, I think, was the worst. Most elephants recover from a mad fit within a few days, but Hannibal, well, he would keep up a tantrum for weeks and months at a time. He then described the longest spell Hannibal ever had begun. It started one morning in June of 1854 war while traveling with the menagerie from Pawtucket to Fall River. Hannibal broke away from his keeper and ran 13 miles, smashing everything he could. Dr. Graves said Hannibal looked as large as a locomotive that morning, smashing a butcher's cart loaded with mutton, killing the horse and breaking the driver's arm, scattering the quarters of mutton along the highway. He smashed 2 vegetable wagons, flipping them over and killing the horses as well. He even carried the mangled remains of a dead horse 50 feet to a pond and threw in his lifeless body. When the fury of his fit was spent, Hannibal was found beneath a tree on a roadside, completely exhausted and, for the moment, submissive. For the many weeks following, he was kept under strict surveillance, as to approach him during a period like that was dangerous. One morning in Vermont, about 3 weeks later, Graves found him with a number of women and children petting him while he was swinging his ears in evident enjoyment. Only then did he consider that the spell had been broken, and he said that there was no more trouble with Hannibal the rest of that season. It was around this time that Hannibal was reported to have been traveling with the menagerie through Battle Creek. By then, there were new elephants traveling in the show with him. I first learned about this visit when reading a chapter in Tales of Battle Creek by Bernice Bryant Lowe. However, Miss Lowe did not indicate the year when this happened. I finally tracked down an article written some 30 years after the incident in the Sunday Morning Call in 1886, which indicated the information was taken from eyewitnesses to the event. According to the Sunday Morning Call article, Hannibal was described as the Jumbo of his time. He was not as tall as Jumbo, but was heavier in appearance and more solid. When Hannibal came to Battle Creek while majestically marching down Main Street, the old pachyderm stepped on the mill race bridge and went into the mill race with a crash and a splash. The bridge had been given way with his great weight. The kids watching the incident went wild with excitement, while old Hannibal bellowed, showmen shouted, and women screamed. The boys along the street enjoying the spectacle were shouting. It was a performance not advertised, to say the least. The showman attempted to clear away the planks of wood, but eventually old Hannibal freed himself. He lifted away the heavy stringers, which were made of logs hewn only on one side, with his trunk, and finally cleared away enough debris so that he could climb up the bank. The article said that Hannibal came through Battle Creek a second time at a later date, but remembered the bridge in downtown and would not be made to cross it the next time. I suppose the parade had then to choose a different route through the town. In my introduction of this video, I mentioned the year 1854 as being the time Hannibal visited. The Sunday Morning Call article of 1886 mentioned that this incident with him occurred some 30 years prior, during a time when several different circuses came through Battle Creek the same year. I was not able to find any articles or advertisements during this time period of the menagerie that Hannibal was traveling with, but I did find references to another circus that traveled from Kalamazoo to Marshall in July of 1854. I therefore concluded this may have been the same year the writer was referring to, as it was 32 years prior, but Hannibal's visit could have been on a different year during that period. Newspaper records, unfortunately, during this period are thin because many have been lost. Apparently, up until 1845, Hannibal was pretty good-natured and was very used to his keeper, a man named Put Townsend. One day, Put had trained him to drive in the stake in the ground which was used to chain him. Put started the stake in the ground and handed the sledgehammer to Hannibal to complete the job. Hannibal made a blow at the stake and missed and hit his own foot instead. He threw the sledgehammer so far it took them over an hour to find it, and they could never get him to pick up the sledgehammer again. Now let's go through some other incidents in Hannibal's life. In 1849, while in Collinsville, Ohio, a stranger gave Hannibal a pail of water. He drank the water leisurely and then suddenly turned his head and struck the man with his tusk. The man died from the injury. While chained up in Williamsburg, New York in 1857, he broke out in a furious fit during the absence from his tent of the keeper. After demolishing a wagon filled with sawdust, he turned his attention to cages loaded with some dangerous animals and began tossing them left and right. Fortunately, the really dangerous ones did not escape, and only a hyena, which was later rounded up. He then sailed down the street, dragging his chain behind him, trumpeting in defiance. The attachés of the menagerie eventually drove him into a stone yard where he became wedged in between some boulders and was eventually calmed down. The article said he was then led back to his quarters, docile as a lamb. So basically, Hannibal was just in the mood for some elephant fun. In 1859, while in Mississippi, Hannibal was ordered to swim the Black Warrior River when the river was quite swollen. Instead of crossing the river as directed, he started a voyage of discovery downstream, emerging some 12 miles downriver. One winter, 2 menageries were laid up in a storehouse on the bank of the canal in Pittsburgh. Here, Hannibal, for the first time, was thrown into the society of Queen Anne, a female elephant from the other menagerie. They were fastened side by side, and an immediate attachment sprang up between them. It was a case of love at first sight from the moment Queen Anne was brought into his presence. She would run her trunk into his mouth, an elephantine style of kissing. All winter long, these two lovebirds carried on. In the spring, when Queen Anne was taken away to start her annual tour, the rage of Hannibal at the separation was terrific. It began the first 11 days when he refused to touch a morsel of food, and the only nourishment he received was some whiskey in his water. On the 12th day, he broke loose and took over the establishment. He raged around the building and even stood on his hind feet and endeavored to tear the rafters off the roof with his trunk. He was eventually brought under control by a small army of handlers and hobbled back into his stall. It was reported that Queen Anne was of a gentler disposition and bore the separation with exemplary resignation. I know some of you out there are shaking your heads right now saying, was that really necessary, Hannibal? While the rest of us are recalling old scars and feeling the kinship with that elephant right now. There's probably a country western song in this about fractured elephant love or something like that. Other incidents I found regarding Hannibal were in an article carried in the Burlington, Iowa State Gazette dated in 1858 when a false report of his death circulated the nation during that year, which originated in Cleveland. It described an incident in Maine when Hannibal was shut up in a shed for the night and found 3 or 4 miles away the next morning with the roof of the shed still on his back. Another incident occurred when he had a falling out with some of the horse performers in the menagerie. One day, while they were making their grand entree into the ring during a performance on their high-mettled and gorgeously decorated horses, Hannibal burst from his fastenings, rushed into the ring, and unhorsed every man in the performance. He then turned around, returned to his accustomed place, and allowed his keeper to tie him back up again. Don't mess with that elephant. Makes you wonder what they did, doesn't it? Going from Boston to Salem one time, he became enraged at something or other and began tearing down fences, tipping over wagons, and tossing men and horses into the air. While traveling in Vermont, his keeper fell ill one time from what sounded like an epileptic fit falling off his horse. Hannibal immediately took him up in his tusks and held him there and letting the keeper's dog lick his face until he revived. It was in that position that the rear van of the fellow travelers found him when they arrived on the scene. Traveling once in New Hampshire, Hannibal met a long line of carriages filled with people going to church. A man in a red carriage struck the elephant a smart blow with his whip as he passed, and Hannibal immediately unloaded the whole line of carriages. No one was seriously injured, but Hannibal made it clear where that carriage driver could shove that whip. I mean, seriously, what kind of idiot would mess with a 15,000-pound elephant like that? In 1860, one night as his keeper was driving him through a strip of woods in Vermont, a violent thunderstorm arose. A tree was struck by lightning, and one of the shattered branches struck the keeper and killed him instantly. All night long, the elephant watched the dead man closely and tenderly, as a mother might watch over the corpse of a child. And never from that moment on would he leave him until the man was eventually buried. So ultimately, Hannibal meant well, just like any one of us would probably identify with. He did have his mischievous moments, but most of the trouble he seemed to have was from others around him and how they treated him. Another incident of rage occurred in October of 1862, where a man that was described as being deranged approached Hannibal and was harassing him, whereupon Hannibal became angry with him and killed him with his tusk. Following the incident, Van Amberg had his tusks sawn off. Hannibal was said to have eaten a regular diet of 400 pounds of hay and a couple of bushels of oats daily, along with some allowance for apples and gingerbread, as the generosity of visitors would bestow upon him. He also sometimes had access to an acre of clovers for a salad. It's funny that there was no mention of peanuts, which has kind of become a cliche with circus elephants since then. His only beverage was water, but he consumed a couple of barrels a day of that. However, sometimes he was given some whiskey, as noted earlier. Now, let's revisit his size. Somewhere in the early 1860s, the last attempt to weigh him, they had him climb on a 14,000-pound scale, and he broke it. So it was estimated that he weighed between 15,000 pounds to perhaps as much as 18,000 pounds, which the latter may have been an exaggeration, but who really knows? He did break the scale at 14K. However, when you look at it reflecting once again on the typical stats of an Asiatic elephant, Hannibal was an amazing specimen of a pachyderm, far larger than the National Geographic records of today for Asiatic elephants. 3 trumpets for Hannibal, huh? During his shows, his owners had a magnificent golden fringed and embroidered covering manufactured for him at an expense in the 1860s of $1,000, which would be the equivalent of $33,500 today. Basically, he wore the cost of a Mercedes-Benz A-Class vehicle as an outfit. That elephant was classy. News reports of the day stated Hannibal lived to be about 100 years old at the time he died in 1865 after eating poisonous laurel in the Pennsylvania mountains. Other references indicate he was probably closer to 65 years old, as he was most likely only 24 to 25 years old when he arrived in America in 1824. During his lifetime, he was reported to have killed 12 men. The amount of property damage in today's prices was probably close to $1 million in his lifetime. If Hollywood ever made a movie of him, it would probably be a good action flick. I wonder who would get to play Hannibal. Going out on a limb on this one, but I'm thinking Arnold Schwarzenegger. His owner, Hyatt Foster, had his remains buried where he died in Pennsylvania, and later offered to disinter his skeleton and present it to the Central Park Museum in New York City if the city could pay the expense of getting the huge frame there. The city declined. He later presented the skeleton to the medical college in Chicago. The museum was destroyed in the Chicago fire of 1871, and Hannibal's skeleton was destroyed with it, lost forever. The Van Amburgh show was in operation for well over half a century and traveled through many small towns, villages, and cities from the Hudson to the Mississippi. I found records for them visiting many of the towns in Michigan during those years, frequently running the same ads or with slight variations as the shows changed over time. In closure, when looking at the story of Hannibal, his story has some good in it, some bad, but in the end, he was really just an elephant living the best life he could, considering that he was in the captivity of humans. Statistically, he was the largest elephant to ever visit North America, and Jumbo was the tallest. However, Jumbo only toured 3 years before his untimely death. Hannibal toured over 4 decades. Additionally, Jumbo did not have his tusk in the years he was with P.T. Barnum, as they had been sawn off, whereas Hannibal retained his full tusk for his entire time with the menagerie up until the last 3 years of his life. As for his visit to Battle Creek, I think the city and the community should consider doing something to honor his legacy of his little mishap here, much like the city of St. Thomas in Ontario have done for Jumbo. I will put a link to a video on this in the description below so that you can see what they have done if you're curious. I was not able to find any statues of Hannibal in North America when I searched. However, there are plenty of statues of his namesake, Hannibal the military commander, around the world. It's likely his legacy over the years has been overshadowed by the story of Jumbo, and most people probably don't even know he ever existed.
So now that you have heard the story of Hannibal the elephant, and his little mishap that happened right here in downtown Battle Creek. I had this idea that together, our audience, you, other people that we could reach out to, we should all come together and raise money to create a monument to Hannibal in downtown Battle Creek, because I really think Battle Creek could use a good elephant statue. And what better way to have fun than to commemorate something that was completely unique and bizarre, and perhaps involved the largest elephant in the world. So let me know what you think about that in the comments. Maybe that'll be something that I have to campaign in 2022. But let me know. Put some thoughts down there. Tell me what you think about that. If you liked today's video, please take a minute and hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel. Share this video with others, most definitely. And I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.